Hey guys! So, in this video we are going to talk a little bit about perspective. So, let's get into it. Now, what I mean by perspective, well, that can mean many things. So, I'll not dilly-dally anymore and I'll just tell you what type of perspective I'm talking about. Well, I'm talking about the sort of perspective that you gain from working in different environments. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because the other day I was speaking to some of my coworkers, and you may or may not know this, that I work at these days I work at well, I don't know what size of, it depends on your definition of the size of the company, I suppose, but I work at a small to mid-sized startup, and this is my second startup in my career. It's the bigger one that I've been working at, and before that I worked at a fairly large enterprise. So the thing is that we were talking, right, and my coworker started talking about different environments, and we talked about previous job experiences. And this person I was talking to explained that he used to work for a fairly big company, and he found one of the things that he found that for him was fairly frustrating was how much process there was involved in every decision. There was a lot of overhead and decisions that had to be made, and for the most part the company itself focused quite a bit on all of this how to put it, overhead, let's just call it. There was a lot of overhead, and he found it very liberating to work in this, to be able to make his own decisions at a smaller startup, and to be able to work much faster and basically have more influence, if you will, over how he did things. And he kind of got into this, and I've heard this so many times before, where certain developers who are of what I call a certain breed of developers will bash talk the corporate environment, and they talk about the liberation of themselves, and they talk about having the freedom to pick their own tech stack, to be able to make their own decisions and affect the work that they do. And I always thought about that, so I let him kind of do his thing, and then I answered, when he just started asking me about my previous experiences, and I said, well, you see, the thing is that the way that I look at it is that there's always pros and cons with each working environment, because you see, although I can agree that the downsides of working at usually the downsides are with working in a very large company. Now, there can be multiple versions of it, but for me the biggest downside is, as you say, there's quite often quite a bit of overhead. There's often, you have to consider that things are going to take longer. You test things for longer, you sit in more meetings. Usually there's a lot of more process involved in working at a very large company. And absolutely, I agree, that can be very frustrating, especially if you have really long meetings. But I also would argue that if it's done correctly, it can be a pretty awesome thing. And he kind of looked at me, okay, how can you make meetings awesome? And I said, well, I'm not saying meetings necessarily, I'm saying that when you work at a really large company, the reason why you have that much overhead is because the project and the company's size and the interests of the company is very different from the interest of a small company. For a small company, usually you need the iteration speed. You usually need people to be able to make quick, fast decisions, because the company simply can't afford all that overhead process. Now, the big companies have this overhead process for the most part and struggle with figuring out a way to kind of maintain their speed and still be able to maintain quality, because that's actually where that overhead process is coming from. Because the company is usually so massive, and the projects that they maintain are already making that amount of money, and it's already supported and being paid for by so many different investors and stakeholders, all that process becomes necessary, if you will. And it's just a different way of working for me, because if you turn it on its head and say, all right, that's the downside with working at the big company. What's the upside? Well, the upside is that in general, the quality of the software that is being produced is higher. Now, I'm not saying that the project is better, because usually the problem with really large companies is that you usually have a lot of legacy, and there's a lot. It's a really big system. And if you think about it, like the way that I think about it is that if you took that massive super project, yes, there will be issues, but the quality, quote unquote, of the project should in theory be higher because you're paying more attention to it. The reason why the project still might be complicated and have a lot of bugs is because the system itself is really complicated. But if you took that massive super project and put it in the hands of a startup, they would fail even worse, most likely. Well, I'm not saying always, but in theory, I mean, they would have the same problem because the project is complicated, not because the company necessarily is inefficient. And so we kind of talked back and forth about that, and then I made the argument, I kind of made this statement. So you see, the way that I look at it is that, I mean, you have the same downsides if you work at a small startup. The thing is that working at a startup, yeah, sure, if you want to make your own decisions, but just think about it. Like, what do you mean by making your own decisions? Like, there's still somebody who's going to sign off on all the decisions you make. You may be able to work quicker in a more relaxed environment, and there might be less meetings and less overhead, but those are just some of the so-called benefits. The downsides is that you're most likely going to have to put in a lot more work. There's a lot more stress involved because you have, like, just in general, more stress, and you have all these other issues that a small company faces. And the thing is that, to me, it's just different ways of working. There's always good and bad. And honestly, and I think I shocked him a little bit with this one. Honestly, like, I've been working at a few different levels now, and in my next company, I'm actually considering maybe to go and start working for the government for a little while. And he kind of went, "What? Are you serious?" Yeah, and maybe even working for Volvo IT here in Gothenburg. Now, for you out there, you may not know this, but Volvo IT, like, it's almost a standing joke here in Gothenburg that that's like the most conservative place in Gothenburg to work for. Like that's their processes have processes that I've never worked for them. They might be absolutely lovely, and that's exactly what I was trying to tell my colleague. Like, for me, it's just an experience. It's about learning how to work in a different environment. Because if I'm the sort of person who can, I'd like to be that sort of person that can simply go into any environment and just look at the situation and say, okay, these are the things that are good with this, and these are the things that are not so good, and just make it work. Now, I may not love to work in a specific way, and I may not love everything about every situation that I find myself in, but to me, I would rather try it out and see what's good about it and learn from that experience, as opposed to saying that, oh, I don't want to work for a big corporation because there's all these meetings, or I don't want to work for a small startup because it's so chaotic and so forth. I mean, I don't know. I have this is just me, maybe, but I have this obsession with being what I call a universal person. I want to be able to, I don't have to like it necessarily, not necessarily have it be my favorite thing, right? But I want to be able to see the good and see the bad in every situation, and be able to be equipped to deal with every situation. And that's why I would find it very interesting to work for, say, the Swedish government or something like that, just to see the difference in contrast. Because if you've only worked in one environment, it's very hard for you to see both sides. And my coworker kind of we couldn't really see eye to eye on absolutely everything, but he could respect my viewpoint, because I mean, he has only worked in a certain environment, and I have worked, you know, in a varying degree of environments. So what I want you to take away from this, guys, is that don't look down your nose at what you think is going to be, how do I put it? Because there's so many developers, especially the startup types, who will look down their noses and look at a big company and say, oh, it's probably really shitty to work at a big corporation. Trust me, I've been at a big corporation. It varies quite a bit from corporation to corporation. And then you have the corporation people who say that, oh yeah, working at a startup, it's just chaos, and there's just a bunch of frat boys who don't know how to be professional. That's not true either. Just, you know, give it a chance. Give whatever you're judging the benefit of the doubt, and just try it out. because I do that for as much as I can, and so far, or at least I'd like to think so, I'm actually pleasantly surprised most of the time. And the best part about it is that you learn quite a lot from trying out different environments and just trying to objectively look at what's good about that environment and what's bad about that environment. That's at least what I've found. Have a great day.